It all started on a chilly November morning in rural Illinois. The air was crisp, the sky painted a soft gray, and a faint mist clung to the grass. Nathan, a 33-year-old mechanic with a penchant for minding his own business, was taking a rare day off. He'd packed his old thermos with coffee and driven his beat-up pickup truck to his favorite fishing spot near the train tracks that cut through the countryside. Nathan wasn't looking for adventure, just a few hours of peace. As he stepped out of his truck, a faint, high-pitched sound caught his attention. At first, he thought it might be the wind whistling through the tall grass. But then it came again, this time clearer, a desperate yelp. He stopped in his tracks, straining to locate the source. "What the?" he muttered under his breath. The sound came from somewhere near the railroad tracks, about 100 yards away. He squinted, scanning the horizon, and saw nothing unusual at first. But then a subtle movement caught his eye, a flicker of black and tan fur in the distance. His heart skipped a beat. It looked like a dog. Nathan hesitated. He wasn't the type to leap into action. Life had taught him to pick his battles carefully. But something about the urgency of that yelp, raw, desperate, compelled him to move. He grabbed his flashlight from the truck, even though the sun had already risen, and started toward the tracks, his boots crunching on the gravel path. As he got closer, the scene that unfolded stopped him dead in his tracks. There, tied tightly to the steel rails with what looked like a rusty chain, was a German shepherd. Her body was lean, her fur matted with dirt, but her eyes burned with a mix of fear and defiance. She barked frantically as Nathan approached, her voice hoarse. Beside her were two tiny puppies, barely a few weeks old, shivering in the cold. They were huddled against their mother, their little whimpers blending with the sound of her barks. "Jesus Christ," Nathan whispered, his heart pounding. Who the hell would do this? The sight was almost too much to process. The mother dog strained against the chain, her front paws scraping against the ground as if trying to shield her pups from him. But Nathan wasn't her enemy. Far from it. He knelt down slowly, keeping his voice calm. "It's okay, girl. I'm not gonna hurt you," he murmured, though his own hands were trembling. He reached out cautiously, but the dog growled, a low, guttural warning. Nathan pulled back, not wanting to scare her further. But then a sound in the distance made his blood run cold. The faint, rhythmic clatter of an approaching train. "No, no, no, no," Nathan muttered, his eyes darting to the horizon. The train was still far enough away that he had time, barely. But the sight of it, a looming steel monster barreling toward them, turned the situation from dire to life or death. Nathan scrambled to his feet and looked around, searching for anything he could use to break the chain. His flashlight? Too weak. His truck? Too far. Panic set in as the train's horn blared, a bone-rattling sound that made the puppies yelp louder. "Think! Damn it!" he shouted to himself. Then he spotted it. A heavy rock near the tracks, jagged at the edges. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He rushed back to the dog, who was now barking wildly, her eyes darting between Nathan and the oncoming train. He grabbed the rock and smashed it against the rusty chain, over and over again, each swing fueled by adrenaline and desperation. The train was closer now, its horn deafening, the vibrations shaking the ground beneath him. "Hold on, girl," Nathan gasped, his arms burning from the effort. "Just hold on." Finally, with one last swing, the chain snapped. The German shepherd lunged forward, nearly knocking Nathan over, and clamped her teeth gently around one of the puppies to carry it. Nathan scooped up the other, his chest heaving as he sprinted away from the tracks with the dog right behind him. They cleared the area just as the train roared past, the force of it whipping the air around them. Nathan collapsed onto the grass, clutching the tiny puppy to his chest. The German shepherd stood a few feet away, her body tense, her ears pinned back. She placed the other puppy on the ground and growled softly, as if to say, "Don't come any closer." For a moment, neither Nathan nor the dog moved. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribcage, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. He stared at her, and she stared back, her amber eyes full of mistrust but also something else. Gratitude. Nathan swallowed hard. "Who did this to you?" he asked softly, though he knew he wouldn't get an answer. He looked down at the puppy in his arms, its tiny body trembling. Whatever had just happened, Nathan knew one thing for sure. His quiet morning was over, and his life had just taken a turn he never could have expected. Nathan spent the rest of the day on edge, replaying the encounter with the man on his porch. Every time he thought about the stranger's words, "You'll regret this," his stomach churned. Who was he? And why did he care so much about the dogs? Was he the one who'd chained them to the tracks? The questions weighed on him, but he didn't have time to dwell. The shepherd wasn't making this easy. She was restless, pacing the living room like she was searching for a way out. The puppies, on the other hand, had adjusted quickly. They seemed perfectly content, waddling around and stumbling over each other as they explored Nathan's house. One of them even tried to climb into his toolbox, earning a small laugh despite the tension in the air. "You're a bold little guy, huh?" Nathan said, scooping the puppy up and placing it back on the blanket. The shepherd watched him carefully, her tail flicking once but otherwise staying motionless. Nathan sighed, running a hand through his hair. He needed to figure out his next move. He couldn't keep them here forever, not with that stranger lurking around. And yet, the thought of handing them over to anyone, even a shelter, didn't sit right with him. He'd saved their lives. Didn't that make him responsible for them now? By evening, Nathan decided he couldn't stay in the dark. He needed answers. The man from earlier knew something, and as much as Nathan hated the idea of confrontation, he couldn't just wait for the guy to show up again. "All right, girl," he said to the shepherd as he laced up his boots. "I'm gonna figure this out. You just keep an eye on the place, all right?" Her ears perked up, and she let out a low whine, as if she understood he was leaving. Nathan hesitated, then grabbed an old broomstick from the corner and jammed it under the doorknob as a makeshift barricade. It wasn't much, but it made him feel slightly better. He drove into town, his mind racing. The streets were quiet, most of the shops already closed for the night. Nathan headed straight to the one place he figured might have some answers: the local diner. It was the kind of place where gossip flowed as freely as the coffee, and if anyone knew who the stranger was, it would be someone here. The bell above the door jingled as Nathan stepped inside. A few heads turned, but most people were too busy with their meals to pay him any attention. He walked up to the counter, where a woman in her 60s was refilling coffee cups. "Evening, Emma," Nathan said, giving her a small nod. "Well, if it isn't Nathan Harper," Emma replied, raising an eyebrow. "Haven't seen you in a while. What brings you in?" "Just looking for some info," he said, lowering his voice. "Ran into a guy earlier, older, wearing a flannel and a ball cap. Seemed off." "You know him?" Emma's expression darkened. She set down the coffee pot and crossed her arms. "You talking about Earl?" Nathan shrugged. "Didn't catch his name. He said something about dogs. Made it sound like he was looking for them." Emma let out a sigh and leaned on the counter. "Yeah, that sounds like Earl. He's bad news, Nathan. Runs a puppy mill out on the edge of town. Been in trouble with the law a few times, but nothing's ever stuck. People around here keep their distance." Nathan's jaw tightened. "A puppy mill?" Emma nodded. "Sells the dogs for quick cash. Doesn't care about their health or safety. I wouldn't be surprised if he was the one who dumped those dogs you found. Probably figured they weren't worth the trouble." Nathan's fists clenched at his sides. He felt a surge of anger. Not just at Earl, but at the entire situation. How could someone be so cruel? And how could the law keep letting him get away with it? "Thanks, Emma," he said, his voice tight. "That's all I needed to know." He left the diner without ordering anything, his mind racing. Now he knew who Earl was, but that didn't solve his problem. If Earl wanted the dogs back, or worse, wanted to silence Nathan for good, what was stopping him? The guy clearly wasn't afraid of breaking the law. Nathan pulled into his driveway just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The house was quiet, and the makeshift barricade was still in place. He let out a breath of relief and stepped inside, greeted by the sight of the shepherd standing in the middle of the living room. Her ears perked up when she saw him, and her tail wagged slightly, just enough to make Nathan's heart soften. "Miss me?" he asked, closing the door behind him. The puppies were curled up on the blanket, fast asleep. Nathan crouched down and scratched behind the shepherd's ears. She flinched at first but then relaxed, leaning into his hand. For the first time he felt like maybe, just maybe, she was starting to trust him. "I met your old pal Earl," Nathan said quietly. "Don't worry. I'm not letting him anywhere near you or your kids." The shepherd looked at him with those intense amber eyes, and for a moment, Nathan felt like she understood exactly what he was saying. He sat down on the couch, running a hand over his face. The weight of the day was catching up to him, but he knew he couldn't afford to let his guard down. Earl wasn't the kind of guy to give up easily. That night, Nathan barely slept. Every little sound made him jump, and he kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see Earl's truck parked outside. The shepherd stayed by the door, her body coiled like a spring, ready to defend her pups if anyone came near. Nathan stared at the ceiling, his mind swirling with thoughts. He didn't know what his next move was, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let Earl win. Not this time. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Nathan sat up and rubbed his eyes. The shepherd was still by the door, her head resting on her paws but her eyes wide open. The puppies were stirring, their tiny yawns breaking the silence. "All right," Nathan muttered, standing up. "Time to figure this out." He didn't know how, but he was determined to protect them, no matter what it took. Nathan's plan, or lack of one, was gnawing at him. He wasn't the kind of guy who sought out fights, but it was clear that Earl wasn't going to let this go. The image of that man standing on his porch, with his smug expression and veiled threats, had burned itself into Nathan's mind. He had to figure out how to keep the dogs safe. That meant staying ahead of Earl, even if it meant putting himself in harm's way. The morning passed in a blur. Nathan busied himself fixing up the spare room, transforming it into a makeshift sanctuary for the dogs. He nailed plywood over the broken window, pushed an old mattress into the corner, and even found an old dog bowl that had belonged to a neighbor's Labrador years ago. The shepherd watched him work from the doorway, her amber eyes tracking his every move. She still didn't trust him fully, but she'd stopped growling whenever he came too close. The puppies, on the other hand, were unbothered, stumbling around the room and occasionally chewing on Nathan's shoelaces. He found himself smiling at their antics, despite the stress. "All right, you guys are all set," he said, standing back to admire his work. The shepherd sniffed at the mattress cautiously, then lay down, curling around her pups. Nathan felt a flicker of pride. It wasn't much, but it was better than the cold, hard ground by the train tracks. Just as he was about to grab his phone and call the local shelter for advice, the sound of a truck engine rumbled outside. Nathan's chest tightened. He peeked through the curtain, his stomach sinking when he saw Earl's beat-up truck pulling into the driveway. The shepherd sensed the tension immediately. She stood up, her body stiff, her ears pinned back. A low growl rumbled in her throat. The puppies huddled close to her, their little bodies trembling. "It's okay," Nathan said softly, trying to calm both her and himself. "I've got this." He grabbed the old shotgun he kept by the front door. It wasn't loaded, but Earl didn't need to know that. He opened the door just as Earl was stepping out of his truck, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Morning," Earl said, his voice dripping with false politeness. "Thought I'd come by and see if we could have a chat." "Not interested," Nathan replied, keeping the shotgun tucked under his arm. "You're trespassing, Earl. Best turn around and go back the way you came." Earl smirked, leaning against the truck. "Look, Nathan, let's not make this harder than it needs to be. Those dogs you've got, they're mine. You don't know what kind of trouble you're inviting by keeping them." "Trouble?" Nathan's voice hardened. "You mean the kind of trouble where someone chains a mother and her pups to a set of train tracks? You're a real piece of work, Earl." Earl's smirk faltered for a second, but then he shrugged. "Dogs like that are a dime a dozen. Wasn't worth my time to keep M. But now that you've gone and stuck your nose in my business, I figure I might as well take M back. You don't want to be on my bad side, Nathan." Nathan's grip on the shotgun tightened. He felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, but he forced himself to stay calm. You're not getting anywhere near them. Not now, not ever. Earl's eyes narrowed. That's so? Nathan took a step forward, his voice steady. Yeah, that's so. And if I see you on my property again, I'll call the sheriff. Hell, I'll call every news station in the state and tell them what you've been up to. You think people are gonna buy dogs from you after they hear what you did? For the first time, Earl looked rattled. He opened his mouth to say something, but Nathan cut him off. You've already lost, Earl. Walk away. The two men stared each other down, the tension crackling like a live wire. Finally, Earl let out a scoff and shook his head. You're gonna regret this, Harper. Mark my words. Nathan didn't flinch. He stood his ground, watching as Earl climbed back into his truck and slammed the door. The engine roared to life, and the truck disappeared down the road, kicking up a cloud of dust. Nathan stood on the porch for a long time, his heart pounding in his chest. When he finally went back inside, the shepherd was waiting for him by the door. She looked up at him, her ears twitching, and let out a low whine. Nathan crouched down and scratched behind her ears. He's gone, he said quietly. You're safe now. The shepherd leaned into his touch, and for the first time, she licked his hand. Nathan felt a lump rise in his throat. He hadn't realized how much he needed that small gesture of trust. Life with the dogs settled into a new rhythm. Nathan made trips to the store for dog food, puppy pads, and toys, and he found himself spending more time with the shepherd and her pups than he ever expected. He named the puppies Max and Daisy, and after much deliberation, he started calling the shepherd Bella. She seemed to respond to it, her tail wagging faintly whenever he said it. Earl didn't show up again, and Nathan hoped it would stay that way. He contacted the local animal control officer, who assured him they were keeping an eye on Earl's operation. It wasn't much, but it was a start. One evening, as Nathan sat on the porch watching Bella play with her puppies in the yard, he realized how much his life had changed. The quiet, predictable routine he once clung to was gone, replaced by a chaotic but deeply rewarding bond with these dogs. He hadn't planned on becoming their protector, but now he couldn't imagine letting them go. They needed me, he murmured to himself. And maybe I needed them too. Looking back, Nathan knew the experience had changed him. It had taught him that standing up for what's right often comes with risks, but it's worth it. Bella and her pups had been through hell, but they'd found safety and love because he decided to take a chance. If you see someone or something in need, Nathan would later tell his friends, don't look the other way. You never know how much good you can do, or how much it'll change your life. And as Bella rested her head on his lap, her eyes full of trust and gratitude, Nathan knew he'd made the right choice. Thanks for reading. I'm so glad you enjoyed this story. It was one of those that really tugs at the heartstrings and reminds us of the unexpected ways life can change when we step up for those who can't help themselves. Nathan's journey with Bella and her pups isn't just about rescuing dogs. It's about courage, compassion, and realizing that doing the right thing is always worth it, no matter how hard it might seem.